الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know if there is anybody to tell them good morning. As you know, from all over the world,
There is.
there are participants already. Yes. Mustafa Hocam, it's good morning for you.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning.
Wa alaikum salam. Very nice.
Morning.
Very nice. And yes, Dr. Nasrin also. From the east, west, middle, so many, alhamdulillah, throughout the world. So today we have our colleague, Edward Omar Moad. He will be giving us today's webinar. Dr. Moad received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Missouri, Columbia. And at the moment, he is serving as Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Humanities at Qatar University. His areas of interest have been primarily Islamic philosophy, and I know he is very good expert in Western also, and therefore his approach is also comparative philosophy. He has published numerous articles on Islamic philosophy, comparative moral epistemology, and he has a textbook. We really need this textbook. Recently in Turkey, some universities, they started this course. Hopefully now that we know, we can order it, inshallah. It's Logic and Critical Thinking, an introduction for Muslim students. So we hope that this can be used as a textbook in our universities also. This is published in 2017. And today, he will be giving us a webinar on a very important topic, especially in philosophy. It's for a long time has been discussed in different circles, and the controversy actually started with Al-Ghazali, I should say, but of course goes all the way back to Ibn Sina and our well-known Mashai philosophers. That is the divine knowledge. Their explanation they provided, and it was criticized by Al-Ghazali. So it seems that he wants to relate this to also the idea of Tawheed, the divine unity. So the topic of today's discussion is Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd on divine unity and knowledge. I am pleased and honored also to introduce Edward Omar Moad to present. Yes, please go ahead, Brother Omar.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I was muted and I didn't know.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my honor I'm pleased to join you, and I feel honored to be invited to present. And I have to say before, disclaimer, I don't feel like I have a competent grasp on this topic. It's a question and a topic that I sort of started to look into and started to realize that it was deeper than I previously thought. And this is part of my kind of ongoing project and research into the Al-Ghazali's incoherence of the philosophers, or Tahafut al and Ibn Rushd's response to that in his Tahafut al Tahafut. So I decided I'd call this Light Upon Light, because when I was reading what Ibn Rushd had to say, it brought to my mind that Ayat an-Nur and particularly this line, this verse of it. So I will just go ahead, I guess. Um, there are a number of places in the Tahafut where this topic comes up, and I mentioned in the abstract that the discussion 3 of the Tahafut and the discussion 6. And after I prepared the presentation, realized that it's better just to stick with one part. There was plenty there in discussion 3 to discuss, and so I will just stick with that part. But anybody who's interested in reading further, and probably all of you already know about this much better than me. Uh, there are other points in the discussion of the Tahafut, discussion 6 and discussion 13, and I think discussion 11 also, right? Um, in discussion 3, Ghazali, he disputes the claims of the falasifa, mainly Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, to believe that that the God is the world's agent, and that the world is God's act, right? In discussion 6, the issue that he has with them is their position on divine attributes, and the position that that God doesn't have any attributes really that don't reduce to his essence. So there's also a lot of, let's say, ambiguity about what they really mean by that, and about what he thinks they mean and what he means. But in any case, the question about knowledge comes up there, because Ghazali um, says that the philosopher are not consistent in their claim that God doesn't have attributes, because they claim that God knows, right? And so then divine knowledge comes in, and Ghazali will say knowledge is an attribute, and knowledge is other than the knower. And this is a key question here that Ibn Rushd disputes with Ghazali on there. And in discussion 13, that's where Ghazali takes up the philosopher kind of claim that God doesn't know. Um, he knows things. He doesn't know individuals, right? He knows them in what they call a universal way, which was Ibn Sina's a theory, according to Ghazali, to try to avoid the other theory that God doesn't know anything but himself. Yeah. And that's what we're going to get to here, and talk about Ibn Rushd's response to that. Because in discussion 3, again, Ghazali's issue is with the philosopher's claim to believe that God is the world's agent. And he says that they are inconsistent in their claim to believe that, with respect to three things: with respect to the nature of the agent, the nature of the act, and the relation between the agent and the act. And it's in this third issue, the relation between the agent and the act, or that is the relation between God and the world, where Ghazali, where we're going to take off from here, right? Where this issue of God's knowledge really comes to the fore in Ibn Rushd's response. So the argument that Ghazali makes against them can be summarized in this way. So here we have like the premises of the argument numbered down here. Um, so the philosopher hold that only one can proceed from one, right? And they also hold that God is absolutely one. This is why they claim that God does not have attributes distinct from his essence, right? And what they mean, they seem to mean that God is absolutely one in the sense that um, he doesn't have different aspects, even different sort of dimensions by which you can think of him. So the idea that maybe God has power, will, and knowledge, but these are not three different things. They're just three different, aspects of one thing. It seems that the philosopher Ibn Sina is going to say that's also a kind of a multiplicity, which cannot be attributed to God, right? So from this position they have, we can call it the one from one rule, that only one can proceed from one, right? Plus their position that God is absolutely one. Ghazali says it should follow that only another absolute one could proceed from God, right? The only thing that God could create was another single, simple, indivisible entity. Um, But he says the world is diverse and multiple. It's not just one and simple. There are many things in the world. So for that reason, he claims that the philosopher cannot consistently say that the world proceeds from God, because that claim actually is in contradiction with their previously stated principles. Okay. And then Ghazali takes into account the philosopher response, because he knows what their response is going to be. And that is that the world does not proceed directly from God, but through intermediaries, right? So the only thing that proceeds directly from God, according to their theory, is what they call the first intellect, right? And the first intellect proceeds from God, and it knows three things. It knows itself, it knows that it's contingent, it knows that it in itself is merely possible. Yeah? And the third, it knows its principle, which is God. So the idea here is that this is one thing that proceeds from God, this first intellect, but then this first intellect knows three things, and this three things that it knows introduces plurality. So that plurality arises from this triad in the first intellect, right? And so it's through this, and then other intellects that proceed from the first intellect. According to one of the versions of the theories of this theory, there are 10 of them, because they identified each intellect with one of the spheres, one of the astronomical spheres, right? So the sphere of the planets, the sun, the moon, and then the planets, and then the stars constitute 10 intellects. And they thought that each intellect, well, each actually sphere or heaven was like the body of this, its corresponding intellect. But that's neither here nor there. And Ibn Rushd, even in his response, says it's not important that how many there are or anything like that, that's just speculation. But there's got to be some reason that they think an intellect would proceed from God, and that would be the thing that gives rise to plurality. Yeah. The reason that Ghazali gives for them is that only one can come from one, and God is absolutely one. So the world in its multiplicity cannot come directly from God, but it has to come from God through these intermediaries. But he argues with him that that doesn't solve the problem, right? So he asks, is the intellect that the first is the knowledge that the first intellect has of itself and the knowledge that it has of God identical, or are they different? So if its knowledge of itself and its knowledge of God is identical, then there's no plurality there, and the philosopher cannot explain the emergence of plurality in the cosmos on the basis of this plurality in the first intellect, because there isn't any plurality in the first intellect. And Ghazali's basically saying, if their theory is right, the only thing that could really exist coming from God is a sort of linear series of simple beings, right? Simple unitary beings. But you couldn't have a being which is within itself diverse like the world. Yeah. Um, so say if they're distinct, though, if the first knowledge of itself and its knowledge of God are distinct, then there is a plurality in the first intellect, right? And in that case, you could say, maybe plurality arises from that plurality in its knowledge. But then the problem is that would mean the first intellect itself is plural, and the first intellect proceeded from God. So it seems like, well, two things we could say. One is that a plural thing arose directly from God, actually, despite what the philosophers claim, which is because the first intellect itself is plural. And then we'd have to say that yes, something which is multiple and diverse can come from something which is one, and the one from one rule isn't true, right? And secondly, he asks, if what God knows himself and knows others, and so that means that the plurality that they claim is in the first intellect, and by which they explain the emergence of plurality in the universe, is also in God, right? Um, and so he says, then just let this plurality be, this kind of plurality also, apply to God. So the the response of the philosopher to that is that God only knows himself, and his knowledge of himself is himself. And so, for that reason, his knowing himself doesn't constitute plurality. And he doesn't know anything other than himself. He only knows himself and not other things. And that maintains this idea of God's absolute unity, along with the idea that only one can come from one. Um, but Ghazali responds to that by saying, this is such an outrageous position. Even Ibn Sina would not subscribe to that. And that's why he said that God knows other things, but in a universal way, right? Um, Ghazali says those who say that God only knows himself but nothing else are actually in the position of claiming that God's creation is superior to God, because God's creation, the first intellect, knows itself and knows God, so it knows itself and other things, where God knows only himself. So that means God's creation would be superior to God. And for Ghazali, that's an outrageous, position. So Ibn Rushd's response here is essentially to say that God knows all other things and yet only knows himself. And that is something that he alludes to prior to this. And when you read it, you feel like this is very paradoxical. And then it comes out here in his answer to this. So I'm taking from a particular part of the book, which I thought was most useful in understanding this, or was a useful part, because his position here isn't really all collected and explained in one organized form. He sort of alludes to it here and there in different parts of the book, and you have to put it together. So you have to find a place where what he writes is, sort of helpful and most explanatory, because many things he says in passing, and you have to kind of put together what his comprehensive view is in order to understand what each part that he's expressing means at any time. And for myself, I haven't got that all in my mind yet, so I'm still in the process of trying to understand that. And I'm going to bring these out, and hopefully some of you can help me to put that together, or point out if I have a mistake or overlooked something. But I found a passage there in his response in discussion 3, and he tells us something pretty clear here. He says, this problem as a whole is based on two necessary points. First, if God thought existence in such a way that they should be the cause of his knowledge, his intellect would necessarily be transitory, and the superior would be brought into being through the inferior, right? This is a point that Ibn Rushd makes repeatedly in the Tahafut al Tahafut in these sections. The idea here is that, when we know something, the existent thing, the object of knowledge, is the cause of our knowledge. So that, my mind, my soul, or my faculty of knowledge is affected by the existing thing in such a way that it's brought into the relationship to that thing, which, in virtue of which I know it. So my knowledge is an effect of the thing known, right? Um, and that's why I come to know it after being ignorant of it, and then maybe I'll forget it. So my knowledge is transitory for that reason. It's a kind of a process of change. But God is the first cause of everything. So his knowledge cannot be something which is an effect of some of other things, right? It wouldn't make sense to say that God knows his creature because of his creature, when in fact the creature is the way that it is because of God, right? So God knows what he's gonna create before he does it. Or let's say he knows what he's going to create from eternity, right? And his actual creature that he himself created is not going to be the cause of his knowledge of that creature. The creature is not going to inform God of something, right, in any way. So God's knowledge is not an effect of the creature. God's knowledge is the cause of the thing that he knows, not the effect of the thing that he knows. Um, and that's the reason why they took the view, or they arrived at the position, that God knows only himself and not other things, because the idea here would be that if he knew other things, right, then at least if he knew other things in the way that we know other things, then he would be the effect of the thing he created. So that's really, it seems, what Ibn Rushd's position is going to be here, is that he's going to say, well, God doesn't know other things in the way that we know other things. And ultimately, the idea is going to be, it seems, that God does not know other things as other things. Because if he knew them as other things, right, there would be other things affecting his knowledge. But he knows them as not other than himself. And so that's kind of explained in what he says next, right? So the second point is to say that if his essence did not contain the intelligibles of all things and their order, there would exist a supreme intellect which would not perceive the forms of existence and their order and proportion. So in that point, he's basically repeating Ghazali's point, right? So if, like that, what Ghazali said, if God did not know other things, then we would be positing a superior intellect which doesn't know, right, the things that exist. And there's no sense, right? What would make it a superior intellect if it doesn't know anything except itself, right? Um, so when we put those two together, we get what he says here. And since these two cases are absurd, right, neither of those can be true. It follows that when this principle thinks its own essence, right, when God knows himself, and the when here is actually a non-temporal when, obviously, because God doesn't come to learn about himself. He eternally knows himself. Yeah. But these existence exist in it in a nobler mode than that in which they exist by themselves. So now we have something different. We have something strange here. These existence, these things that God knows, exist in his essence, right? For Ibn Rushd, God is knowledge. So to say that it exists in God's knowledge and to say that it exists in his essence is the same for him, I think. And they exist in that in a nobler mode than that in which they exist by themselves. So it seems like the very reality of the thing that he knows exists in him more fully, right? Or it's in his knowledge more real than it is in external to his knowledge, right? So, and that's just one passage. So you see, I took quite a lot of time to try to explain each part, or at least to try to understand each part, because I'm not absolutely certain that I fully understand it completely. But this is just one paragraph, almost one sentence here, I guess 3 sentences, and I'm just quoting it. So it reads like that. This problem as a whole is based on two necessary points. First, if God thought existence in such a way that they should be the cause of his knowledge, his intellect would be necessarily be transitory, and the superior would be brought into being through the inferior. Secondly, if his essence did not contain the intelligibles of all things in their order, there would exist a supreme intellect which would not perceive the forms of existence in their order and proportion. And since these two cases are absurd, it follows that when this principle thinks its own essence, these existence exist in it in a nobler mode than that in which they exist by themselves. So we have to ask what he means by this nobler mode, and how an existent can exist in different modes. Yeah. And he's really good here because immediately he gives us an example and explains to us. So he says, and that one and the same existent can have different degrees of existence can be shown from what occurs with color. So he gives us this example of color, and he shows us different degrees of existence by which the same color exists, right? So you have its existence in matter, right? Let's say, your car is red and you have the redness right there in your car. Well, that's in matter, right? And he says this is an inorganic existence without consciousness. But then there's existence in sight. So the color exists also in sight. When you see the red color on the car, now it exists in your sight, and that's a higher existence than when it was just on the car. And the reason is because, very interestingly, how he puts it, it exists in such a way that color becomes conscious of itself. So he's saying there that when color is seen, color exists in a self-conscious way. Like color is now aware of itself. Whereas when the color is just on the car or the matter, it's not aware of itself. And that's because matter is not aware. But it's kind of strange to us to think, how is the color now conscious of itself? I mean, when somebody sees the color, the person is conscious of the color, but color is not conscious of itself, right? And this comes from an idea of Aristotle that Ibn Rushd uses a lot and is very important here. That Aristotle said, knowledge and its object are one, they're identical. Yeah. So that the idea is, if you were to, if you know something and the knowledge that you have is different than the object, then it's not knowledge, right? Because what you know is different from the thing known, and that will be called, that doesn't match, right? When you think something about a thing which is not true of it, then you don't know it. You're wrong about it. Yeah. So Aristotle's idea here is that, for us to actually know something perfectly, fully, our knowledge must be identical to the thing known. So that instead of a relation between a knowing subject and a known object, we just have this one thing which is now sort of self-aware, right? So when we see color, it's not as if color is a separate thing from our sight, because what we see has to be the same as the color. And when what we see is the color, then we see the color. And that is the same as saying that color sees itself. So we have color existing in matter in which it's not conscious of itself. That's like, imagine your car is there, but nobody's looking at it. The color is not being seen by anyone. So for him, he's saying it's without consciousness. But then when the color is seen, it's conscious of itself. It's seeing itself, right? And that's because the color that is in your sight is the color that is being seen. And so that's the key point. And then after that, he says, well, after that, there's existence in the imagination. And that's superior because that's independent of any external object. You don't have to be facing the car to see the color of it. You can imagine the color of the car or whatever color that you're imagining in your mind, right? And then existence in the memory, and then existence in the intellect, right? When you know what the color is, in terms of it, you've grasped its intelligible form. And then after that, existence in the divine intellect. And that for him is the highest degree of existence possible. Yeah. So it seems like the highest degree of existence for anything is the existence that it has in God's knowledge, right? And that every mode of existence of a thing, that could be considered to be, outside God's knowledge, right, is to that degree not as real. It's like unreal. Yeah. And so it does seem like the conclusion here is that anything which is not actually basically God, right, is not God to the degree that it doesn't really exist. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. At least that's a kind of a, I mean, that's a kind of a controversial, definitely a controversial conclusion. But when I'm reading here, Ibn Rushd, it's something that seems to follow from his logic. So what it seems to me is a very kind of wahadat al-wujud conclusion, but on the basis of what are supposed to be straightforwardly rationalistic philosophical premises. Anyway, so last section here about what we can talk about as the cosmic organism. Because right after this, Ibn Rushd goes on to say, to make this argument. So he says the philosophers have proven, for example, that every animal has a principle by which its various potencies are unified toward one act, right? So any living thing, like a tree or a fish or a dog, right? There's something which unifies all of its potencies, its abilities, right, and its tendencies uh, into one creature, so that all the parts of the body, for example, act in a certain way that tends toward one goal, which is to preserve to make this creature exist and to preserve the organism, right? So that was what Aristotle understood as a soul. The soul is the principle of the living thing which unifies it into one living thing, right? And guides all the processes, all the biological processes that happen with it to keep it one organism. Yeah. Um, so uh, he says then from that the parts and the potencies of the cosmos also tend toward one act. And so now he's really talking about like the heavens, how they rotate, and just the way to, uh, what they thought in the cosmology at that time to kind of to bring about the order of the world, because they thought that the order of the motion of the heavens is the basis of the order of the world. Yeah. um, so that the parts and the potencies of the cosmos also tend toward one act, which is the existence and the preservation of the world. And therefore, the cosmos is also an animal, right? It's also like a organism with a unifying principle that proceeds from God, right? And then he says here, there is in them one single spiritual force, which connects all the spiritual and bodily potencies, and which permeates the universe in one and the same penetration. And this is going to be God's knowledge, right? Um, and then we find Ibn Rushd essentially agreeing with Ghazali, because Ghazali's original point against Ibn Sina and Al Farabi was to dispute their idea of the one from one rule, because he's basically saying, yes, God is one, but the multiple diverse world can come directly from God, even though he's one. And then there's no need for these intermediaries. And he even was arguing that the system of intermediaries doesn't really solve the problem, right? So the only thing that we can say is that, a diverse cosmos actually does come from God, right? Despite the fact that God is one. Yeah. Um, and Ibn Rushd agrees with him here. So he says, so this is just following on this issue from before, where he said there is one single spiritual force which connects all the spiritual and bodily potencies, and which permeates the universe in one and the same penetration, right? It's God's knowledge of the cosmos actually that connects it and establishes it as one single existing thing, one organism. So he says, and it in no way follows from the fact that this one potency permeates many things, that there should be a plurality in it, as those thought who said that from the first principle there can, in the first place, emanate only one from which plurality can then emanate. For this statement can only be regarded as valid if the immaterial agent is compared to the material agent. So Ibn Rushd is saying here that Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi made the mistake of thinking of God, the immaterial agent, the intellect, right, as analogous to the material agent, when they concluded that only one could come from one, right? And Ibn Rushd is telling us that when that thing is an intellect, when the agent is an intellect and not a material agent, that's not the case, right? And then he's going to go on to kind of explain that. So this is another thing that's a little bit, let's say, obscure, that I'm trying to clarify in my mind. How does an intellectual agent differ from a material agent, and in what sense is the intellectual agent an agent, right? And it also is connected to another question I'm having: is what are these intellects, these separate intellects, supposed to be that the philosopher postulate, and that even Ibn Rushd is postulating, even though he disagrees with Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina about um, this one from one rule, right? And as applied to these intellects, he still uh, believes that there are these intellects, right? But it doesn't seem like they are intermediaries between the one and the many in the same way that Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina thought. So he says that the term agent can only be applied equivocally to both the immaterial agent and the material, which is to say that we use the same word for both, but the meaning of agent in each case is actually completely different. And there's only some kind of, an analogical relation between the two senses of agency. And so I'm going to suggest, as a part of my own trying to wrap my head around it, that the immaterial agent is like the premises of a deductive inference, right? So let's say if we try this thought experiment, we'll say, imagine that the immaterial agent is like the premises of a deductive proof, right? And in deductive proof, like we're often taught, the conclusion is not other than the premises. It's actually just another way of conceiving the premises, right? We don't actually get from the premises something completely new. We only extract from the premises what's implicit in there already, right? And so it's just another way of conceiving the same thing, right? And so if we consider the premises of a deductive inference to be like the agent, an intellectual agent, like two ideas, right? Um, that are the agent of the conclusion, then it could be like this. The agent is not other than the effect in that case, right? But just another way of conceiving the premises. So um, I guess this was brought to my mind because of what Ibn Rushd says here right after that. He says, again, the existence of all other separate principles, that's, for example, the first intellect and however many other intellects there are proceeding from God. He says the existence of all other separate principles consist in the forms in which they conceive the first principle. Yeah. So yeah, like if we consider the conclusion of a deductive inference just to be another form of conceiving what's in the premises, right? I'm kind of going uh, following my thought something parallel to that. So let's take another experiment and let's say that a demonstrative proof of God's existence can be understood as a form of conceiving God, right? So if we want to know, well, what kind of conception of God could we possibly have? Well, it seems like intellectually our conception of God's often um, you know the result of or consists of one of the some proofs of God's existence that we've come to understand. So God is the cause of everything, and so we know based on our cosmological proof that anything that comes to be has a cause. Yeah. So we have various proofs, right, of God's existence, and they differ from each other because of the kind of premises that they start with. So some proofs of God's existence start with the existence of motion, and some proofs of God's existence prove that God exists on the basis of contingency or order in the cosmos, right? So I wonder then if we might kind of grasp what Ibn Rushd is getting at by thinking of these different types of proofs as different conceptions of God in different forms, right? And they differ from one another because of the vantage that you start with, right? Because of the fact that they start from different existing principles in the cosmos. So motion is a principle, contingency is a principle, order is a principle, and in each case, you are, inferring the existence of God on the basis of this single principle of the cosmos, and then in a way which I think you might say connects to the whole of the cosmos and then connects God to the entirety of the cosmos, right? Mm. Um, but this is us as material intellects trying to arrive at proofs of God's existence. And so these are always going to be incomplete and basically kind of, let's say, uh, groping the best we can, right? But the intellects, these intellects, these separate intellects are not material intellects. And so it might be as if instead of thinking about proofs of God's existence that material intellects like us try to arrive at or try to construct, it is actually the truth of, the true proofs. Like maybe that we don't know them, but it's like the entire um, conception of God's relationship to creation from the vantage of one principle in creation or another, right? So that would actually constitute various forms of in which they conceive the first principle. But the thing is, again, just like the color and the sight of the color are not different, right? The intellect and the conception of the first principle that Ibn Rushd is talking about are not different. The intellect is the conception of the first principle, right? And so it seems like they're not actually separate from each other or from God. And so we would end up saying that each of these, is a form of God's self-conception, right? Um, so yeah. Okay, so then Ibn Rushd says here, and it is not impossible that this should be one identical thing, notwithstanding the difference of the forms in which they conceive it. And the same way, it is not impossible that a plurality should be conceived through one and the same form, right? Um, yeah. So different forms of conceiving one thing, right, can nevertheless be forms of conceiving an identical thing, right? That it's one thing. That's what his point is here. This is the case when we're talking about the immaterial agent, right? The intellectual agent. Okay. Um, right. But there's a little bit of a difference here because I earlier suggested that we consider the premises of a proof like the agent, right? The cause, and the conclusion of a proof like the effect. But actually, it should be the reverse. Yeah. The conclusion of a demonstrative proof is it's its end, right? It's its final cause or purpose. And Ibn Rushd says that God is the agent of the universe by being its end. So he then says here, and it is evident to the philosophers that he who uh, bestows on the material existence their end is identical with him who bestows on them their existence. For according to them, form and end are identical in this kind of existent, and he who bestows on both form and end is their agent. So we would be saying there that the purpose of the cosmos is to be like a proof of God, God being the conclusion of that proof. Then God is the agent by being its end, and by being its end, it bestows on it its existence, right? So it's being the purpose and it's being the sort of efficient cause that brings about its existence are not different, right? Because the form and end, he says, are identical in the case of the intellectual existent, right? The immaterial existing. Okay, and then, well, that's about that. That has to do with the in immaterial existence. But what about the sensible existence? That's another question that I have to get myself clear on. Because how does Ibn Rushd actually then um, suppose that the material changing world comes about, right? It's one thing that, God have these various self-conceptions, and then we can think of them as various intellects, right? But they're all eternal and they're all immaterial, whereas we have this world here of changing material, sensible things. And he mentions that here. He says, and as to his relation to the sensible existence, he is, since he bestows on them the unity which causes their plurality and the unification of their plurality, the cause of all of them being their agent, form, and end, and all the existence seek their end by their movement towards him. And this movement by which they seek their end is the movement for the sake of which they were created. And insofar as this concerns all existence, this movement exists by nature, and insofar as this concerns man, it is voluntary. And therefore, man is of all beings the one charged with duty and obligation. And it just crossed my mind that the idea here might be, or something underneath here, is that the material world exists for the sake of man, right? This voluntary creature. Because, yeah, we are understanding these intellects, of course, by analogy to our own intellect, and then saying that these are immaterial and eternal and not transitory and material like ours. But the material universe which exists here, and which is one which exists in order for us, we could say, to live in and to exist, and by means of which we arrive at knowledge of God, right? Um, and so that may be what ties it together. Although, and I'm still wondering what the principle of materiality, where the principle of materiality comes from. So uh, I don't know, maybe somebody else who knows Ibn Rushd better than me would know what to say. Um, is it the case that material things, the materiality of material things is really just a function of their sort of relative non-existence? Or is matter actually a thing that God also creates? And is it one of the principles, right, that constitutes the existence of the cosmos in some way? Yeah, there I'm at it. I hope somebody can help me. I hope this was interesting, and I hope that maybe somebody has some suggestions of where I might be able to understand this more clearly. But thank you very much for your time and for listening. Even though I didn't really have something firm, I was presenting some what are like more like reflections and questions. And I hope that would be something, maybe valuable to anybody here. And again, I'll finish. Thank you very much. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you very much, Edward. Just there are some questions in the chat box. Let's continue with Mahshid's question because it's relevant to the last point. She's asking, what do you mean by exactly by material agent?
Yeah. So a material agent, that would be, I guess, it would have to be an agent in time, an agent that changes, right? So if I put coffee on the stove and boil it, right, or water on the stove and boil it, then I'm in a material agent because I take time to do that, and I'm a material thing.
Does that material agent have a will and power of its own to bring into things into being, into action?
I don't think for Ibn Rushd, material agents don't actually bring anything into existence. That's my understanding. So material agents only prepare the matter, right, for form to sort of to be informed by something, which then would result in an existing thing. But the actual existence is always from an immaterial agent, which is then the giver of forms, right? One of the final intellects, which bestows form on matter. So
How do they prepare the matter?
Right. So yeah, good question. So okay, like in the case of a human being, I mean, human being is a material agent which can come to exist by conception, right? So we have an act, between a married couple that prepares the matter, but the soul is brought from above, right? We don't create that child, right? We just prepare the matter for the coming into being of that new person, and that's an example of that, right? Mm-hmm.
You mean so the preparing matter is just basically attempting sunnatullah, bringing the matter that already exists together, not creating anything as such, not being as agents, but playing about with the things that already Allah has created, bringing them together.
Yeah, that's right. The preparation of the matter would have to be according to the system that Allah has already established. Yeah.
Okay, so there's no external agent as such creating, it's just within Allah's creation, and it's just the moving, changing about in certain proportions, like making a cake, I suppose, putting things together.
Yeah, putting things together, I guess so. Right.
Okay.
So if the question is about, when you think about it this way, this sort of supposed distance between you know, Ibn Rushd and Ghazali on occasionalism and causation seems to, it's not quite as far away as we seem to think, right? But I guess the essential distinction here is that Ibn Rushd is going to say that the system of nature is necessary, right? It's not contingent, yeah. But that's a separate, different question, on which I personally think they're really not as far apart as it at first seems. But yeah, I think your question, you know, connects to that other issue about nature and causality, right?
And what is nature?
Hmm?
What is nature?
Well, I guess for Ibn Rushd, as an Aristotelian, he'll say that nature is whatever is changing. Nature is whatever changes.
Okay. In other words, motion.
Yeah, nature is motion, right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Yes, or whatever is studied in physics.
you.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the funny thing, right? Because in physics, we look for natural laws that don't change. So I don't know. Yeah.
I think we have also to add whatever is changing by itself, not by an, outside agent. Nature, I mean. The principle of nature is within Aristotelian philosophy, as you know, it is within herself, not outside principle.
Yeah, I guess I understood that to be the definition of a living thing, right? Yeah. So the organic nature. Yeah.
Yes, Ibrahim, go ahead. You have a comment in the chat box. Can you please read it for us?
Oh, so okay, okay. You want me to read the questions here?
No, Ibrahim can ask his own question.
Oh, okay, okay.
Turn on your microphone, please.
As you have also a book on critical thinking, I am curious about the level and breadth of the debate between two great minds of Muslim thought. What do you think about the debate between them? Although they are not in the same period, of course, this debate has shaped also, you have a great impact on the Muslim thinking. Just from the critical point of view, what is the place of this debate?
The debate between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd.
Yes.
You know, I think that the place that it should have may not be the same as the place that it historically has. Yeah. So for me, I find the debates really important and interesting because, I mean, that might be just because of idiosyncrasies of my own individual type of person or whatever, where I'm coming from. But the debate is really helpful for me to kind of clarify my understanding of God and God's relationship to the world, right? And that's because I actually don't take either of them. I don't dismiss either of them. I haven't decided that one of them is right and the other one is wrong, but I really consider them to be two very sincere and, you know, very intelligent people who have, you know, really thought about these things, and are really engaged in the debate. So when you know, I think that Ibn Rushd wrote the book responding to Ghazali, not simply because he thought Ghazali was totally wrong and he was defending, you know, philosophy or religion. I think that Al-Ghazali actually raised questions for Ibn Rushd's mind, which bothered him, and he wanted, and he was responding in a process of actually arriving at answers to Ghazali's objections, right? And that Ibn Rushd actually has a kind of a third position. I don't think that we find Ibn Rushd is just Aristotelian, but that he actually has new ideas that were inspired by his felt need to respond to what he really encountered as serious issues that Ghazali raised. And so I think that it's a really interesting discussion for that reason. Now, in the history of Muslim thought, I think people have kind of sided one or the other. So we have the pro-Ghazali side, the kind of like, he's an Asherite and they're basically the sort of dogmatic Asherites, right? And then you have the kind of they seem to be a lot of times Shia that sort of latch onto Ibn Sina and then Tusi and then Mullah Sadra. That's a different school of thought. I'm not saying that that's necessarily Shia. I think that a lot of Shia are not agreeing with philosophy at all, but most of the people really into that seem to be from that side. And then you have another group of people that latch onto Ibn Rushd as their kind of champion of Muslim rationalism or maybe Arab modernism or something like that, right? And so everybody has taken a participant in the debate to represent a kind of an ideological faction. And so most of the time they dismiss the other side, as obviously wrong. And most of the time, I think that most of these people who do that haven't really digested the debate and haven't really benefited from the debate in the way that they could. Yeah. So I think the role that it should have in Muslim thought is actually to give us an occasion to really sort of deepen our thinking, right? But the role that it has had is a kind of a battleground for sort of, you could say, sectarian or factional disputes, polemics and so forth. So I don't think Ghazali was trying to kill reason or destroy the mind of the Muslims, like some people say. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Edward. This is excellent.
May I ask my second question?
Yeah. Mhm.
Do you think that Ghazali disturbed with the implication of their understanding of Allah? If Allah doesn't know individual things, there may be some moral implications for that. When we look at Said Nursi, we see him also is the gist of Risale Nur. He says in one place is to just is contemplation on the creation of in the perpetual creation of the universe, and then connect to see in the universe the perpetual creation, and then to feel he's in the presence of God, he or she. So I think if Allah doesn't know the universe or the individuals, only his knowledge is limited to the universes, so he doesn't care for our action or about our moral values or moral life. I think the background is maybe something like that is disturbing Ghazali when he's criticizing these philosophers.
Well, that's clearly stated. He clearly states that the denial that God knows individuals will nullify any kind of moral dimension of man's relationship with God, right? And I think that's correct. Yeah. Really, Ibn Rushd agrees with Ghazali, I think, more than he agrees with Ibn Sina. And that's because what Ibn Rushd tells us is that Ibn Rushd tells us that he says that God knows everything, even the individuals, right? More than anybody else could, right? More than any other kind of knowledge that could be had of them. But he says that this is neither universal nor individual, right? Because he says that both of the types of knowledge, the knowledge that's universal and the knowledge that is particular or individual, both are created kinds of knowledge. They're caused by the existence, right? So when I know there's an individual person in front of me, it's because the light bounces off them, enters into my eyes, and affects my faculties. And it's because I'm a material agent that can be pushed around by other things in the world, right? In this way, which is the reason I can have knowledge of individuals, because knowledge of individuals comes from the senses, right? And the universal knowledge, like when I can sort of arrive at the abstract intelligible of human being, right? And have this kind of knowledge of the human being, this is also an effect of the actual individual thing on my faculties, on my mind. Because the Aristotelian way this works is that through experience of individual things, my mind is made to abstract the form, right? And arrive at the universal the intelligible universal. And so that kind of knowledge is also an effect. And so Ibn Rushd says that God's knowledge of things is therefore neither universal nor particular, right? As opposed to Ibn Sina, who is saying that God knows individuals only in a universal way, because for Ibn Sina, universal knowledge was the real knowledge, right? But Ibn Rushd is telling us the real knowledge is neither this philosopher's universal knowledge, nor is it individual knowledge, right? It's something that's beyond both of those, and it's beyond both of those because it is the cause of its existence, and the object of knowledge is not the cause of God's knowledge. God's knowledge causes its object, and that's the key difference. And the thing is, it seems that it follows from that God's knowledge, which would be the knowledge, the perfect knowledge, the most full possible knowledge of the thing in its innermost reality, is the way God knows it. And God knows it in a way in which he does not know other than himself, right? And so it seems to follow that in the innermost reality of anything, it is not other than God, right? And to the degree that it can be thought as other than God, it's as if it is only other than God in as much as it fails to fully understand itself. You see what I mean?
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Nejati, please go ahead. Please turn on your microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much for this great presentation. Though I confess I was driving and but I tried to pay attention to understand. If I got it wrong, please excuse me. But I think my understanding here is when you look at the debate, it seems like it's all about perhaps is this cosmological argument and the first cause or prime mover. Then from that kind of you see that they also relate to knowledge. And while we know Ghazali is occasionalist, is actually, and in a sense that, so he gives everything directly to God. And Nursi's position on this one, if I understand correctly, Nursi think that to really go to the cosmological argument and the first cause, it's very, very hard and very difficult and it's this long. And it seems in their argument as well, it seems like it's maybe very highly intellectual and intelligent people can follow the debate. But one question I have, what is really this implication of this for ordinary individual? Could they from such argument can really understand it, or is this something only for high intellectual? That's one thing. And Nursi, it seems like in Nursi's writings we see more argument by design rather than really cosmological arguments that in a sense he will use, ana, self as and in terms of wahid qiyasi, and he wants to really, go through everything. And in regard to the knowledge, I remember one piece I was reading that Nursi is referring to shuri kulli in a sense that whether his argument is that if, let's say, every object has certain somehow consciousness that, or, they will say that there will be somehow not the same level of perfection or equal level of perfection in everything. He called it on. So in a sense that he says that when you look at it, it's like, that you don't see such big diversity in terms of like the perfection in the creation, that he says that means this all come from a shuri kulli, that there's infinite knowledge that's basically manifested in everything. So that's a common question, so I wonder whether you look at Nursi's argument in this regard and what is the difference. And second is that how do you think the discussion here can help the ordinary individual with a little, let's say, educational background or intellectual background?
Well, probably not that much, and that's why Ibn Rushd, I think, would agree with you, because he continually apologizes in the Tahafut al Falasifa or Tahafut al Tahafut for engaging in the discussion, because he doesn't think that it's suitable for the audience that he thinks is reading Ghazali's book, right? And similar to Nursi, Ibn Rushd also says that the teleological argument from design is also he thinks that's a better argument than the kalam argument, the cosmological argument. For the same reason, I think also that you said that it's easily intuitively understood by the general public, right? But also I think because I think Ibn Rushd feels that the design argument latches onto an important aspect of what God is in terms of his relationship to the world that the cosmological argument does not, right? And that the cosmological argument simply gives us the cause of the existence of something that may not have existed, right? Whereas the teleological argument, in the way that Ibn Rushd understands it, really gets down to the nature of being itself, because the order in the world that the teleological argument starts from is, I think, for Ibn Rushd, really essential to the being of the world itself. So you can't talk about, you know, the coming to existence of a thing without talking about its order and proportion and its sort of, you know, design, right? The design of a thing is its being. So the nature of God's causation, the nature of God's creation, for him is, you know, essentially that ordering, that like, you know, and that's why I think, you know, it is very resonant with the verse there that Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, right? Because light, and Ibn Rushd mentions Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar several times, saying, hey, Ghazali said this in Mishkat al-Anwar, so he already agrees with me, basically. He agrees with the philosophers. And now he's, you know, disputing and he's debating against Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and then he's giving as if these are the views of the philosophers as a whole, right? And Ibn Rushd is saying, well, you know, here Ghazali is debating them, but he actually has this view in Mishkat al-Anwar, which he talks about in that book, what it means when God says that he is the light of the heavens and the earth, and that it really means that for him, light is being, right? So light is like that which brings to knowability, right? To intelligibility. Yeah. And the reality of things is their intelligible form and their intelligible nature, right? But since it, you know, Ibn Rushd is bringing here this very important point from Aristotle's the Anima, from his psychology, that knowledge and the object of knowledge are one, they're the same, right? So that the intelligible form or intelligible reality of a thing is the thought of the thing, right? It's the very thought of the thing when that thing is being thought of by one who thinks it fully, right? So, yeah, the reality of the thing and the, let's say the reality of the thing that God intends to create and creates is not other than the very idea and knowledge that God has of what he's going to create. They're not two things in a relation, but exactly one thing, right? And so the very fact that we can even learn or conceive or understand even the little bit of the universe that we can already shows that the innermost reality of things is its intelligible quality or dimension, that which we can understand, right? And so the fact that the world is intelligible itself proves that, you know, not only that God exists and is the creator of the world, but actually I think for Ibn Rushd, much more so about what the nature of God's creation is and the nature of the reality of the world is than the cosmological argument does. Because all the cosmological argument tells us is, here's a thing that might not have existed, right? But it does, so it had a cause. But it doesn't tell us anything about what kind of a thing it is or what it is for a thing to exist in the first place.
Well, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Mustafa Tuna has a question. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. First of all, I also need to start with the caveat that it's probably above me. I mean, you said you didn't fully grasp it, and I certainly did not grasp maybe 10% of what's going on. So the question is intended to understand what's going on, mainly probably by trying to carry it more into the more familiar kalam literature, like when you talked about, cosmological argument and teleological argument, etc. So my understanding of God's knowledge is something that comprises not only the knowledge of what exists, but also the knowledge of what could have existed, right? So that means we are not only talking about what is designated to exist, but also what is possible. And the realm of what is possible is much larger than what exists. And the differentiation between the realm of what is possible and realm of like what comes into existence within the realm of what's possible, it is the intervention of God's will and then God's power. So I was wondering how putting things in these terms, expanding our conception of God's knowledge beyond the knowledge of what exists, could help us understand this discussion or expand the discussion.
Right. Yeah, that's a really key point. So I think that you understand it a lot better than you said. So you said you did, because yeah, one of the key issues here that even though it sounds really beautiful, what Ibn Rushd has told us, is that a key premise for him. And if you take away this premise, the whole thing doesn't work, right? I think the key premise for him is that knowledge is what exists. Knowledge is of what is real. And so knowledge is not of what doesn't exist, right? That has to be the case, since it's knowledge of what exists that is the cause of existence. In fact, the existence of what exists is just the knowledge of it. That's all. That's what it is, right? So it's hard on that view then to sort of make sense of what it means to have knowledge of what is not but could have been, unless it in some way is kind of reducible to what is, right? So what we really have here is an issue in the metaphysics of modality, between a school of thought called actualism and a school of thought called possibilism, right? Or you could put it in this way. So the actualists think that everything that we say about what's possible, right, is actually reducible in terms of its truth conditions to something about what's actual, right? Whereas the possibilists don't think so. So, so if you're an actualist, I guess you would say that God's knowledge about what's possible, but what is not the case, is sort of, logically equivalent, right? And therefore reducible to some knowledge of what is the case. Yeah. So, for example, let's say, is I don't know, like a chess piece, is it black or white? Let's say it can't be black if it's white. So the knowledge that it's black entails that it's not white, right? You could say that the knowledge that it's not white is not really knowledge of what it's not. It's actually just what follows from the knowledge of what it is. Yeah. This is just feeling around there, but you're definitely correct. Otherwise, if it's not the case, then God's knowledge of what is not the case is if it is actually another knowledge, independent of his knowledge of what is the case and not reducible to that, then the whole construct, the whole system, I think, of Ibn Rushd is not going to work, right? But I think the other point you made is also important, that this is definitely linked to the notion of God's will and whether God could have created other than he did, right? Yeah, so if it's the case that he could have created other than he did, then, his knowledge seems contingent on his will, right? So his knowledge of what is the case will be contingent on what he decides is going to be the case. Yeah. But I suppose somebody can come back again and say, well, doesn't he always know what he's going to intend to be the case? Is there some kind of time or some state or condition in which God is ignorant of what he's going to do? And then only after he does it, then he knows it. So, yeah, my tendency is to think that these kind of dichotomies somehow are really kind of a result of a limitation on our own thinking, and that somehow this gets unified, right? His knowledge and his will. Yeah. But my personal feeling would be that I want to unify. I think that should be unified in such a way in which God can have created otherwise, and he really does have will, and I think that's really important for Ghazali. So that issue as to whether or not those two perspectives can be sort of synthesized or reconciled between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, that's really important.
Thank you very much. We have a question in the chat box. Professor Wafi Sharif from Nigeria. He's just wondering, what is the impact of Al-Ghazali on contemporary Muslims?
You know, I don't know. I mean, there's a few. So in my, you know, I can only speak anecdotally, right? So I know there's people who are very interested in Al-Ghazali for the right reasons, right?
Yeah.
I think in Southeast Asia and probably in Turkey too, I think Ghazali is considered kind of a seminal figure, like really an authority, almost, you know, an unquestionable authority. And to some degree, I think, at least in my experience in Southeast Asia, unfortunately, maybe they don't really get everything that they might learn from Ghazali because of the fact that they treat him with a certain kind of deference. You know what I mean? And sometimes you don't really learn from somebody that you can learn from unless you're able to ask critical questions about him. Or most importantly, in Ghazali's case, unless you're able to recognize the points at which he is tentative and he's not absolutely sure of himself. Because when people need figures in the history of religious scholarship who they can look to as sort of unquestioned authorities, you see what I mean? Then they cannot allow it that those people themselves are not sure of themselves sometimes. And so they have to overlook those very important points in which the person is tentative and thinking things through and considering different views. And when they actually express that, you know, they're not absolutely certain about something. And this, I think, is impoverishing the Muslim mind to the degree that we do that. In the other case, you know, the Salafis think that Ghazali was the cause of a lot of bid'ah and problems, and, you know, introducing philosophy into, you know, the Islamic science. So we don't have to worry about what they think because they don't matter. They matter socially, but, you know, I don't really, you know, this is just, it's polemic with them, right? And I guess for sometimes some of the Sufis who are a little bit for the, you know, maybe poetic oriented Sufis, you might say, think that Ghazali was too much of a rationalist, right? I see that too sometimes. And then you have the people that blame Ghazali for destroying the Muslim intellect by, you know, writing this refutation of philosophy. And then this totally doesn't make sense to me, because these people, it's like the implication of what they're saying is that Muslims would have, you know, intellectually progressed if we had only just stayed dogmatic Aristotelians. And, you know, that doesn't make any sense, because nobody can progress if they stay dogmatic about any particular philosophy. So Ghazali brought exactly what anybody should claim and understand any culture and civilization needs for progress and for a life of the mind, which is a critical perspective on everything that was in front of him. And in this case, the critical perspective on the doctrine of the philosopher as it was transmitted by Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina actually was I think very productive in Islamic history, rather than the reverse. Yeah. So this is again based on, I think, a really truncated and polemical kind of ideological misunderstanding or misrepresentation of what's going on, and the incoherence of the philosophers.
Well, again, thank you very much. We have just 5 more minutes left. Professor Yunus Çengel. Hocam, do you want to ask your own question?
Yes. I think in relation to Mustafa Tunas's question and Edward's answer, I think, you know, that they were good. But I want to, you know, expand on that one. Number one, I think the core things are the, you know, Esmaül Hüsna, the divine names. And there is no separation among them. That is one name should be in all, and all names should be in one. So that, you know, the unity requires that. And there should be, you know, cohesiveness among them. And also all the names are nur, okay? We translate as light, but it's not a correct translation because light is something physical. Still, you know, it is subject to time because there is a speed of light or whatever, but nur is beyond time and space. And as human beings, being, you know, bound by time and space, we have a difficulty understanding, comprehending what is beyond time and space. So we order things in our mind, kind of compartmentalize things, and we assume, you know, God is that way too, because we don't have, and this is how he does things too. But it is, you know, I think our shortcoming kind of reflecting from our ignorance on God, which has, you know, no relation. God has nothing similar to comprehend him. But let's say in names, for example, can God create something which is not really kind of consistent with the hikmah, that is, has no hikmah? Well, if you look at definition of kudret, yes, but will God create something without any hikmah? No, because kudret also involves hikmah. So he will not create anything which is not consistent with some, you know, purpose, intention, some, I don't know, goals or, you know, whatever. That is, everything is within everything there. And also, knowledge is an existence, okay? It is nur, just like compassion is an existence, not material or physical existence, it is existence. Well, I say we know compassion. Iman is also nur. You know, it is also existence. It exists or doesn't exist. Nothing, you know, material or physical there. So knowledge in its own, you know, form, it's an existence. So Nursi uses the concept visual ilmi, that is existence in knowledge. It doesn't have to have, you know, other kind of existence there. And existence has, you know, levels. If let's say kudret is associated with that existence, visual ilmi, then we have external existence, which becomes, you know, physical. And then, you know, other things. So to me, it looks like, first of all, there is unity in God and the names, and God is nur, nothing physical, so beyond time and space, and nur is not limited to space, which means there cannot be anything that knowledge cannot penetrate. It is universal. Therefore, you know, the notions like, you know, God, okay, knows these things, and that's, I think they are not consistent. So all is within the knowledge of God, all exist, but probably there are different levels of existence. And if, let's say, Edward can some comment maybe on different levels of existence, because I have a difficulty understanding those, it will help.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah,
Edward, you have 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to be, I can easily and quickly answer it because I don't know the answer. I think the levels of existence that I'm asking myself from here, and I guess that I can say he is talking about levels of existence. So initially we kind of think of different, like as an analogy, we might think of different levels in a building. Like you have the 5th floor and the 1st floor, right? So you have these 5 different levels, and the same existent is at each level, so that we think it's the one thing or it's a thing in a different place. But I think it's degrees of existence. I mean, it's degrees to which a thing exists. So like where the lowest level would be just non-existence, right? And the highest level would be just pure existence. Yeah. And so in between, you know, as we've learned from philosophy since like Plato, right, between being and non-being, there's becoming, right? And it's that in between, everything that's other than God is in that in between, right? And of course, there's nothing on the other side of that spectrum because that's nothingness, yeah, non-being. So I guess that's the only way that I can understand the different levels of existence, and that's why I'm rephrasing it, or I'm asking myself, is it correct to re-express what Ibn Rushd is saying here by saying that, a thing is only separate from God to the degree that it doesn't exist, right? To the degree that it actually is non-existing, yeah. So that if to the degree understood fully as it is, and then it is nothing other than God. Yeah. So does that mean that nothing exists other than God? Well, that bothers me because I think it's a kind of a crucial, article of faith that God created other than himself. And it's on the basis of the existence of other than himself that we, come to know God, right? So if we're going to say that otherness, that otherness from God is just non-existence, right? Then it doesn't seem like there is anything really other than God. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that's the conclusion I've arrived at. That seems to follow from Ibn Rushd's explanation here. And that does seem to go straight into what we would associate with Ibn Arabi. And I think that's very interesting because we're especially taught to think of Ibn Rushd as the kind of polar opposite of this Wahdat al-Wujud type of, Sufi thought. And what we have here is, it seems to be kind of like philosophical premises that lead by a way of inference to exactly that same destination. Yeah, so that's what's interesting. As far as whether that's the right destination to go to, I'm not. I don't have a decision. I don't have a judgment. I don't know. I'm ignorant of it.
Thank you very much. It was a very good discussion.
Thank you.
We are right on time, I think, for this week also. It was good to have you, Edward. Inshallah, we'll continue with our discussions again. Just to remind, I put in the chat box also, and our next webinar will be on November 1st. Again, usually at the moment, let's see what will happen in future, because in certain parts of the world, as the winter is approaching, the timing might be different. We might have to change, but next week also we'll have it at 4 p.m. inshallah. And our speaker, Unais Ahmed Nourani, the concept of ideal lifestyle through the perspective of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. So inshallah, we will see you all next time. Thank you very much again for participating. And thanks. It was so good to have you, Edward. Inshallah, see you.
Thank you for having me. Inshallah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you, Moaz.
Thank you very much. It's excellent.
Alparslan Hocam, program tamamlandı herhalde. Kapatıyorum.
Record ediyor muyduk biz Hakan? Ben recording açmıştım ama.
Evet, kayıt aldık. Sıkıntı yok. Ben YouTube'a da atacağım.
Tamam. Selamun aleyküm.
Aleyküm selam hocam.